We who believe in freedom cannot rest until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men.
I think critical race feminism is a theory that focuses on the importance of understanding how a woman's race or perceived race affects her interaction with her society, especially as it pertains to protecting her rights as a woman and as a human being. I don't know.
So I'm not familiar with critical race feminism, but I have heard of critical race theory. So I'm going to take what I know, I have a loose understanding of it, take what I know from that and apply it to critical race feminism. So I would assume that it has to do with the structures of our society and how they have an ingrained sense of sexism in them, and how we as a people sometimes do things and don't recognize the sexist aspect of it, and how it can be different amongst races. So yeah, that's my loose interpretation and understanding.
I think critical race feminism refers to how a woman stands up for her rights, not only as a woman, but as a woman of a particular race. Yeah.
I think that critical race feminism looks at the intersection of race and gender and how it affects our ability to understand who we are. It's a way to conceptualize the construct of gender and race and to look at how the two together affect the roles we play in our society.
Critical race feminism is, I would think that it was the intersection of gender and racial identities and how being a double minority affects identity in general. I think that critical race feminism talks about the double-edged sword of being a double minority, marginalized within a marginalized group. So, love you.
So what exactly is critical race feminism? Critical race feminism is the conflation of both critical theory and feminist theory. But in both of those, you hear critical. So if we were to define those two terms, we have to first explain what exactly is critical inquiry. A critical inquiry pretty much looks at the power dynamics of society, the society that we live in. Who is viewed as having power? Who is viewed as being withheld from power? Who is privileged in the society? Who is oppressed? And so we look at works of people like Paulo Freire, who talks a lot about, especially in his book, The Pedagogy of Oppressed, about the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressee. More specifically, when you look at critical race theory, we see that it comes out of CLS, which is critical legal studies, which fails to necessarily look at the margins of how these minority groups are necessarily affected. It looked at how people as a whole are affected by law and politics and things like that, but it didn't necessarily look at specific subgroups. So out of that, you have people like Derek Bell and Richard Delgado who formed critical race theory, which looks at, like we talked about with critical inquiry, how marginalized groups are oppressed or empowered in a society, and how more specifically those laws affect that marginalization. So when we look at critical race theory in the United States, we talk about it being at the confluence of everything we do in this nation. It's in the laws that we posit and we put forth. It's in the norms and the mores of this culture. It's in the very founding documents of this country that says that at the time of the inception of the country, minorities, or specifically black males, were viewed as 3/5 human. So they were technically viewed as cattle and property. And so those things are inherent in the governing of society today, and we look at issues like Mike Brown and Eric Gardner and these laws that negatively affect people of color, minority people, subjugated groups. And so more specifically than that, then we get into critical race feminism, which recognizes that who I am as an African American and who I am as a Black woman cannot be separated from each other. It looks at the intersection of those two things. It says that when I walk into a room, both my gender and my race speak before me. And so those two things must be considered not as two separate entities, because those dual layers of marginalization affect my day-to-day lived experience. And so when we look at feminism, feminism calls for the equity or the equitable treatment of men and women. And so when you look at a society like what we live in, you saw the different liberation movements that were experiencing. So in that, you would have had, America's liberation from Britain. And then further than that, you had African Americans or enslaved citizens, their fight for liberty and justice and the pursuit of happiness, with the ending of slavery and going into the Jim Crow laws. But then you had the women's suffrage movement, which was calling for the equitable treatment of women. But when you saw that movement, you mostly saw white women in the forefront of that, because even still Black women weren't considered, which calls for the need for something that considers both race and gender. And that includes where I live, where I reside, my space and place in society, which is as a Black woman. And so there has to be something that tells that story. And so when we look at the different layers of marginalization at the core of identity in this country, you have white male Christian. And outside of that, you have white female Christian. And then outside of that, you have Black males. And on the periphery, you have Black females. Because not only are women subjugated Black women subjugated on the basis of their race, they're also subjugated on the basis of their gender. So those things have to be considered collectively, not separately. And that's when we get into intersectionality. So feminism, in further exploring why is there a need for critical race feminism, why is there a need to study how both race and gender affects the lived experiences of different citizens and different racial groups and minority groups in this country, you look at a study done by the American Association of University Women, and they have a table that breaks down how much different ethnic groups made in comparison to both white males and males in their own same identity group. So for example, you have Hispanic women who made 53% of the salary that a white man earned. This is in 2012. You have African American women who make 64% of the money earned by white men. You have Native American and Hawaiians who made 66% of the money earned by white males, and white women who made 78%, and then Asian American who made 87%. So relatively, I guess Asian American women are faring pretty well. But even within their own ethnic subgroups, you have Hispanic women who made 89% of the money earned by Hispanic men. You have African American women who made 89% of the money earned by African American men. And Asian American women made 79% of the money earned by Asian American men. So there's still subjugation not only within our own subgroups, within our own race and ethnicities, but definitely in comparison to white males. So how could there not be something that studies how both of those things lead to something like what I just discussed? So that further explains the cause for why is there a need for critical race feminism. Now, in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be mostly discussing critical race feminism from the perspective of a Black woman. So there's going to be a lot of mention of Black feminist thought, womanism, and things like that. But holistically, we can see that there is a need, and there's still a struggle, and there's still a cause and need for exploration of how those two things, those two layers of marginalization, affect the lived experiences of women in this country. Regina Austin, who is a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, says, She says this quote, "The intellectual product of minority feminist scholars should incorporate in a formal fashion the ethical and moral consciousness of minority women, their aspirations, and their quest for liberation." She said this in her article Sapphire Bound, which is sapphire is one of the tropes of the African American woman that we see perpetuated in media and in cultural studies. She also encourages minority female scholars to redefine the sapphire stereotype to testify their social and political circumstances impacting minority women. So this is pretty much positing the charge upon African American women in academia to sort of not, I don't want to say give voice, because to say give voice means that there is a power that is handed over to Black women, but the power is there. There's voice already. It's just smothered under layers and layers and layers of stereotypes, biases, that are perpetuated in the culture, either in our various forms of media, books, scholarship, and overall lack of representation. Regina Austin could very well be one of the people that will be mentioned in this presentation as someone who may not label themselves as a critical race feminist, but could be deemed such through their body of work.
There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything, yeah, was in her eyes. Oh, was in her eyes. I'm telling you, there were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. I never knew that my skin was too black, and I never knew that my nose was too flat, and I never knew that my clothes didn't fit, and I never knew there were things that I'd miss, 'cause the beauty in everything, oh, was in her eyes, was in her eyes.
A former slave talked about the double burden of being both black and a woman, and about the power of women to change the world.
That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as any man when I could get it. And I could bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, seen most sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? That man in the back there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? He came from God and a woman. Man didn't have nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, well, these women here together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And they asking to do it. The men better let them.
And that's when she said, I can do exactly the work that the boys are doing. I can study Greek, I can study Latin, I can study higher level arithmetic, give me the algebra. And so she did successfully advocate for herself. There was some resistance at first. There was this notion that we educate the girls to become homemakers, to become maybe nurses, maybe teachers. She will not need this higher level of education is what the theory was, but she resisted that. She pushed against those thoughts and continued to grow intellectually. And then from here, she launches herself to Oberlin. And there was pretty much a direct route from Raleigh to Oberlin. She is someone who we would call not only a genius, but a lifelong learner. She was in her late 60s when she attains her doctorate degree from the Sorbonne in Paris. As far as we know, she is the first woman of African descent to attain that level of degree from the Sorbonne. She's someone who was relentless in her passion for offering not only to herself access to education, but offering to what the Bible would say, the least of these, access to education. So she was a passionate, lifelong learner, and I think the life of her mind and her spirit was really the heart of her story, the heart of her life.
For instance, how many of us and how often do we really love our work? The principal horror of any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, or which defines human need to the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components of that need, the principal horror of any such system is that it robs our work of its erotic value, its erotic power, its erotic life appeal and fulfillment. Such a system reduces work to a travesty of necessities, a duty by which we earn bread or oblivion for ourselves and those we love. And this is tantamount to blinding a painter and then telling her to improve her work, to enjoy the act of painting. It is not only next to impossible, it is also profoundly cruel.
I asked audiences earlier today to imagine 12 years a slave without Patsy, because it's her whole sexualization, the S&M cruelty that she endures from white male and female. All of it is what gives a certain, quote, spice to the film. So it then leads us to question, do we have to have the black female dehumanized, tortured, raped, enslaved in order to have our spice, our enjoyment? And I put this as a culture because some of you may have remembered that I said at the Melissa Harris about 12 Years a Slave, I was very flip and I said it was sentimental claptrap. Well, I got a lot of feedback from so many people who said they loved the film. And I guess I think all the time about, as a black woman, that when I see images of, like myself, abused, beaten, raped, tortured, I don't feel entertained. I don't feel like I can say, oh, I really like that, or I really learned from that. You know, as I've been saying to people, if I never see another naked, enslaved, raped black woman on screen as long as I live, I'll be happy.
But it would have been different if it had been Patsy's story, if we'd seen it from her point of view.
Well, she had no point of view. That's the dehumanization. I mean, that's the interesting thing about the four fabulous ones up here is we all have point of view. We all have told our stories in some way with our voices, not with...
Maybe I'm responding because I have had reviews in the past that have accused me of not writing about white people. I remember a review of Sula in which the reviewer said, this is all well and good, but one day she, meaning me, will have to face up to the real responsibilities and get mature and write about the real confrontation for black people, which is white people. As though our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze. And I've spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books. And the people who helped me most arrive at that kind of language were African writers. Chinua Achebe, Bessie Head. Those writers who could assume the centrality of their race because they were Africans. And they didn't explain anything to white people. Those questions were incomprehensible to them. Those questions that I would have as a minority living in an all-white country like the United States. But when I read the poetry of César, or the poetry of Senghor, or the novels particularly, Things Fall Apart was more important to me than anything. Only because there was a language, there was a posture, there were the parameters. I could step in now, and I didn't have to be consumed by or be concerned by the white gaze. That was the liberation for me. It has nothing to do with who reads the books.
We have not thought enough about the other side, the flip side of that, which is the politics of racial shame. Because if those unrelated fictive kin can make us feel proud, they can also make us feel ashamed. And the deal with stigmatizing shaming, by the way, not all shaming is bad. You know, Goffman tells us shaming is a requirement for social life. You have to, sort of get into the things that are and are not acceptable to do. But reparative shaming is the kind of shaming that says, I will shame you so that you come back into the community. Stigmatizing shaming says that your very body, your very identity, your very self is malignant, that it might spread. Take, for example, if simply by giving birth to a child, you give birth to a slave, that your body actually reproduces slavery. Or maybe you are the parent of a black boy in Louisiana, and he does poorly on his tests in the 3rd grade, then you have just produced a prison bed in your state, because we determine prison beds in Louisiana based on 3rd grade reading scores. Maybe you are a black woman and you are considering having or not having a child, and you walk into Soho and there is a 20-story billboard that says the most dangerous place in the world to be if you are black is in the womb. That is a shaming billboard by the Right to Life movement, meant to tell you that your very body, your very self, your very reproductive capacity is malignant. The only thing that you can produce out of your black body, out of your black uterus, is blackness, and blackness is malignancy. Blackness is badness. Blackness is failure. See, it's the very identity itself. Not even our first black president, God love him, came from a black woman's body.
Some of the key characteristics that we see as a part of critical race feminism would be intersectionality, like I've mentioned, is the coming together and the confluence of both race and gender and social class and sometimes sexual orientation. But intersectionality, liberation, the struggle for liberation, because as we know, liberty and liberation hasn't been given for women nor African Americans, so compounded. The struggle for liberation is something that we see heavily present in critical race feminism. Phenomenology, cultural studies, because in order to dissect where we are as black women, you can look at the culture, you can listen to the music, you can look at the movies, you can read the books, you can look at the lack of representation. Where are we not found? That's something that we look at. We also look at counter narratives, narrative inquiry. Where am I telling my story? How is that story being retold? Are we forgetting the names of people like Ella Baker? Are we forgetting Shirley Chisholm? Are we forgetting Fannie Lou Hamer, Barbara Smith, Gloria Hall? Are we forgetting Darlene Clark Hine? Are we forgetting these names? Are we speaking these names to future generations so that critical race feminism is something that is perpetuated throughout the body of work of academia, throughout the curriculum, throughout any body of knowing and understanding and space and place? We also look at equity. not to be confused with equality, but equity. We see critical theory, of course, it is the foundation of which we build everything. So there's critical inquiry, there is critical race theory, and then at the tip of the pyramid, the more specific, as Toni Morrison would say, telling the particular to give a picture of the bigger story, you see critical race feminism. We also see unification, which Audre Lorde speaks of quite often in her book, Sister Outsider, which says that we don't have to all be alike to fight for a common cause for humanity. And we learned that it is an act of violence to try to bring the other into the same. And I think that was said by Wittgenstein or Derrida, but that will be included in my bibliography and my references, works cited and things like that. But it is an act of violence to bring the other into the same fort to make me feel more comfortable. But we can fight for the cause of all humanity and honor our differences. There's the quote by Terrence that the late Dr. Maya Angelou would say all the time, is that I am a human being, therefore nothing human can be alien to me. And that's what we see represented throughout critical race feminism. And we also see the struggle for representation, which I mentioned, is where are we and where are we not? And questioning critically, why are we not in those spaces? So when you see a lack of representation in your professors and in academia of Black women, why is that? There must be a question of, it's not that Black women aren't intelligent. It's not that Black women aren't pursuing careers in academia, but what barriers are in place that are impeding longevity in the field? Why are we not getting tenure? Those kind of things. So looking into where is critical race feminism going, in my opinion, there's three different perspectives that I have. There's idealistic, there's realistic, and then there are my concerns, which I guess technically could be labeled as pessimistic, but we'll just see what happens. Ideally, there would be no need for critical race feminism. I know that sounds weird, and it's not because Black women cease to exist, but it's because that we are so enmeshed in society and in media and in culture. There are multi-layered characters of Black women. There are multi-dimensional characters seen throughout our media, whether that is music, poetry, art, dance, anything, that we are so represented that the need for a particular focus area or area of inquiry is no longer necessary, because we can look and see ourselves reflected back in various forms of culture day to day. Realistically, my perspective is that critical race feminism would be a mandated part of the curriculum, not something that students can opt into, because you can't opt into not interacting with African American women in your day-to-day life. You cannot opt into solely interacting with people that look like you, not for a long period of time. And so that I don't think it should be optional that students, especially on a collegiate level, have the choice to learn about other cultures, particularly critical race feminism, or Africana women's studies, or Africana studies, or Latino studies, or Native American studies. Those things should be so ingrained in the curriculum, the core curriculum, because they are, if America is claiming to be this melting pot of cultures, then it should be mandated, required, incorporated, fully ingrained into our day-to-day experiences. And we would then come to know who I am in relation to others, not separate from others. My concern, however, is that the patriarchy is winning, and that we live our lives, especially my generation and younger, in the complete and utter immersion of the white patriarchal gaze. So much so that we don't blink an eye when we see a hypersexualized young lady on TV, that we don't blink an eye when we hear a Ray Rice that, punched his wife and dragged her out of an elevator. We may blink an eye for a minute, like a twinge, but it's something that we are expecting because we're like, well, maybe what did he do? What did she do to provoke him? So you have slut shaming, victim shaming, all those things because we live our lives under the patriarchal gaze, and this is the norm. And that is my concern, that moving forward, there won't be a question as to why, or there will be a question as to why do we need to study feminism? Why does feminism exist? Why are we still talking about racism? And you hear that right now, that the only people that talk about racism are racist. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's because the way that things are have become the norm, and those things have been perpetuated for generations, in that no one thinks anything of it.